Well, that's not supposed to look like that. A few weeks ago, I was pulling my lathe out of the garage when one of the wheels underneath it snapped off. If you've ever moved a lathe like mine, you probably already know what happened next. You see, they're top heavy. I mean, really, really top heavy. Most of that weight is sitting up around the headstock, and once it started going over, there wasn't much I could do to stop it. Unfortunately, I was standing on the side it decided to fall towards. Part of my leg and my hip was caught underneath it, and it left me with a pretty impressive bruise. The live center on the tailstock managed to gouge me in the chest. Nothing serious, no stitches were required, just enough to remind me for a few days that I'm considerably softer than cast iron. The lathe didn't fare particularly well either. When it hit the ground, the motor mount snapped off the headstock. I had a friend who is a welder, and he took a look at it, and his assessment was basically, well, maybe I can fix it. It might be repairable, but welding cast iron isn't exactly simple. Even if we can repair it, I'm not sure what the future of this particular lathe is going to be. So I'm probably going to be in the market for one pretty soon. It also explains why it's been a little quiet around here lately. Between losing the lathe and having grandkids here for the last couple of weeks, I haven't had much opportunity to get into the shop and make anything new. So to those of you who regularly watch Grace, Grit, and Grounds and enjoy these videos, I thank you so much for hanging around, and I'm sorry it's been a few weeks since I put anything out. I'll get things rolling again here soon, or at least turning if I can. I suppose that would be a more appropriate woodworking metaphor. Fortunately, I did have one video left, and strangely enough, I think it might be the right video to come back with. This is a piece of spalted spruce that I had brought back with me from my time in Alaska. It's probably 7 or so inches across. I actually started turning it some time ago, and I'd gotten it sort of rounded and put a nice little tenon on it, but I had some problems. It's a soft wood, there's some spalting, and I could tell there was going to be some issues. And then there was this knot in the bottom of it, and I just knew that I needed to do something. So I filled those areas with epoxy, and I set the whole thing aside for a while. And, this just happens sometimes in any shop, but it happens to me a lot. Setting it aside turned into more than a year. And today I'm finally going to be able to finish this thing. I'm cleaning up the bottom at first, and then I'll flip it around and remove the faceplate and start hollowing it out. I'm not particularly going too deep in this one. I think I want to make this a shallow bowl, maybe like a blessing bowl. So I'm probably going to go about 2 inches or so into it. But that's sort of my plan going forward. While I'm working on it, I want to talk to you about something the accident with the lathe revealed. Not about the lathe, but about me. Because breaking the lathe wasn't actually the strangest part of that night. What happened was afterwards. Once I had collected myself and realized I wasn't seriously hurt, I had another problem. My lathe was lying on the ground. At that point, I didn't even know it was broken. I just knew it was down there. The thing weighs somewhere in the neighborhood of a couple 100 pounds, maybe more. I've never stuck it on a scale. And with the motor mount broken, which I realized after I started to pick it up, part of the motor was hanging loose. It was still attached by the belt and some wiring. And I knew that I needed to get this thing upright. So I just grabbed it and tried to lift it. Yeah, that didn't work out so well. So then I tried again in a different area, and no, still couldn't lift it. Apparently, staring angrily at a piece of machinery doesn't make it lighter. I grabbed a 2x4 I had and tried using it as a lever. I remember the old phrase by Archimedes, if I had a lever and a place to stand, I could move the world. Well, I had a lever, and I had a place to stand, but I couldn't seem to get the purchase I needed, and so I just couldn't seem to get it up. Every time I would lift it up a little bit, the whole lathe itself would move, and it was just not working right. So my wife came outside and I asked her to sit on the legs so I could get some weight on the bottom of it at the opposite end. I was thinking that her weight might give me enough leverage to bite into the ground and so that I could use that 2x4 to lever up the headstock, but that didn't work either. And then she made a perfectly reasonable suggestion. She says to me, "Hey, why don't you ask one of the neighbors to help you?" Now, you've got to understand, I've got a diesel mechanic who lives on one side of me. On the other side, I have a guy who does construction and works at a landscaping company running the big machinery that they use. Either one of them probably could have walked over and grabbed this thing with me, and in 30 seconds, we would have had it standing upright. But I looked at her and I simply said, "No, I'm not going to ask for help." And then she, again, trying to be reasonable, says to me, "Well, maybe you should call somebody." She said, "There's a half a dozen people from the church that you could call that would gladly come over to help me." I knew this, and I knew the church that I serve. It's a wonderful church, and they're great people, and I know any one of them would have come over and helped me. But again, I said no. I had my reasons, so at least the ones I thought I wanted to use to justify it. It was after 8 o'clock, and the people in the church, they all have families. They have things going on. Nobody wants to get that phone call at night saying, "Hey, can you drive over here and help me pick up my lathe?" I just didn't want to bother anybody. I didn't want to inconvenience anybody. I didn't want to be a burden. And my wife was getting increasingly frustrated at me because the solution seemed incredibly obvious. Ask for help. Eventually, she went back inside, and I stood there looking at this machine lying on the ground. And I remember thinking, why won't I just ask somebody for help? That's the part of the story that has stuck with me, because I don't have a particularly good answer for that. I don't know if this is a guy thing. Maybe it is. I know enough men who do the exact same thing that I don't think I'm totally alone in this. And yes, there's probably a stereotype in there somewhere about men refusing to ask for directions or refusing to read the instructions or even refusing to go to the doctor or to admit that they don't know something. And I know stereotypes aren't universally true, but sometimes they hang around because there's at least a little history and a little truth behind them. Whatever you want to call it, I know this much. It's not particularly healthy. Because here's the strange thing. If either one of those neighbors had knocked on my door and said, "Hey, Al, I need a hand with something," I wouldn't even question. I wouldn't even think twice. I would just go. I wouldn't think that he was weak. I wouldn't think that he was incompetent. I wouldn't be irritated that he was interrupting my evening. I'd probably be incredibly glad that he asked. If somebody from my church called and needed me, I'd do the same thing. And yet, standing there in my driveway, I couldn't extend that same grace to myself. Somewhere inside me was this ridiculous little voice saying, "You ought to be able to handle this on your own." I wondered how many of us live with some version of that voice. Maybe it isn't a lathe lying in a driveway. Maybe it's your marriage or your kids, possibly your job or your faith. Maybe it's a nugget of grief that is sitting deep in your chest, potentially loneliness, maybe fear. Possibly you're feeling overwhelmed and exhausted. But when somebody asks how you're doing, you simply look at them, plaster a smile on your face, and say, "I'm fine." Because that's what we say. I'm fine. I've got it. I'll figure it out. I don't want to bother anybody. I don't want to be a burden. And eventually, if we live that way long enough, we can be remarkably good at carrying things alone, especially things that we were never intended to carry that way. There's a passage in Galatians where Paul says, to bear one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. I've read that verse countless times. I've preached it. I've taught it. But there's something hidden inside that command that I don't think that we all talk about enough. If we're supposed to bear one another's burdens, then somebody has to be willing to admit they're carrying one. You can't help me carry something I refuse to let you see. Community requires both sides. It requires people willing to help, but it also requires people humble enough to be helped, to ask for help, to want to be helped. And maybe that's where some of us struggle. We like being needed. We're less comfortable needing. We like being the person who shows up. We're not nearly as comfortable being the person or being the reason someone else has to show up. There's a vulnerability there because asking for help means admitting that whatever is lying in front of me, I can't lift alone. And for some reason, that's a hard thing to say. The funny part is I eventually got the lathe off the ground. I did it by myself. Of course I did, because apparently I was committed to proving the point. I stood there long enough and finally figured out that I could remove the entire headstock from the bed of the lathe. Once I separated the heaviest part from the rest of the machine, I could lift the frame without too much problem. And then I could wrestle the headstock back into the garage separately. Problem solved. Well, sort of. I managed to do alone what two people could probably have accomplished in less than a minute. And I suppose I could tell that story as an example of ingenuity or maybe even perseverance. Hey, everybody, look at me. I figured this out. But that's not really what I took away from it. What I took away was the absurdity of how hard I was willing to work just so I wouldn't have to ask somebody else to help me. And that's worth thinking about. How much extra weight do we carry simply because we refuse to let someone grab the other end? How much harder do we make life because we've confused independence with strength? And how lonely can that eventually become? The Christian life has never really been a story of radical independence. Jesus gathered disciples. Paul gathered traveling companions. The early church shared meals, possessions, suffering, prayer, joy, and grief. Scripture describes us as a body, different parts, different gifts, yes, even different strengths, but we're all connected to one another because we are a singular body. Maybe needing people isn't evidence that something has gone wrong. Maybe needing one another was part of the design all along. And maybe strength isn't always being able to lift the thing. Sometimes strength is being willing to knock on the door next door and say, "Hey, buddy, could you give me a hand?" I'll be honest, I'm still not very good at that. I'd love to wrap this story up by telling you that I learned my lesson and that I'll never do it again. But I know myself better than that. I'll probably still try to figure things out on my own. I'll probably still hesitate before making the call. But maybe next time, I'll recognize that hesitation for what it really is. And maybe I'll ask a little sooner. And so as we come to the end of this episode, I can present this to you. A shallow blessing bowl made from a piece of spalted spruce that traveled with me all the way from Alaska. It had some cracks and some weak spots. It had a knot that needed filling. It sat unfinished for more than a year. And now, well, now it's done. And as far as I know, this is the last bowl that I will ever turn on that old lathe. And that's a little bittersweet. That machine and I made quite a few things together. Hopefully, I'll have another lathe in the shop before too long, and we'll start making some new things. But maybe this was a fitting bowl to finish with, a blessing bowl. Because sometimes the blessing isn't having enough strength to carry everything yourself. Sometimes the blessing is having people around you who would gladly grab the other end. And maybe the lesson, at least for me, is learning to let them. My friends, I appreciate you taking time in this video with me. And I thank you for joining the growing community of Grace, Grit, and Grounds. Until we meet again, my friends, grace and peace. And thanks for sticking around. And remember, grace builds what grit sustains. I'll see you in the next one.